This is the Artemis podcast. We're your co-hosts, Annita
and Paige. There's no one definition of a sportswoman,
but we're here to explore the stories of the million ways to be one
and how sportswomen are leading the conservation movement.
Peveh Hashev. I'm Annita Lucchesi, and Peveh Hashev means hello in my Cheyenne tribal language. Today, we are continuing our dialogue with Indigenous women hunters and anglers, visiting with Deleana Otherbull, who is from the Northern Cheyenne and Crow tribes. Deleana is a climate justice leader and angler and hunter living on a floating home on the Columbia River. In this episode, she discusses what wellness practices look like for women in conservation, how conservation work can be healing, and why the conservation world benefits from Indigenous women's leadership. I am just going to kick it right over to you, Deleana. Go ahead and introduce yourself, share anything about yourself that you think we need to know, and then maybe also tell us what hunting and fishing mean to you as an Indigenous woman.
Great. Thank you so much, Annita, for having me on. I'm super excited. My name is Deleana Otherbull. I'm an Indigenous woman. My tribes are originally from Montana. I'm Crow in Northern Cheyenne. I'm a woman who resides within Portland, within Oregon. And my kind of like my heart really is resides on the river of the Columbia. And so I live on a floating house.
I love your floating house. I still need to come visit, but I just think it's so cool that you're able to like wake up and go fishing right off your deck.
Yeah. So I've been in many different spaces and in many different roles in, my career. And one of the things that I've become really intentional about is the way that I choose to balance, life and work. And so as a person who works predominantly remotely, I really wanted to be intentional about how I live and experience my life on a daily. And so, yeah, I moved onto the Columbia River a little over a year ago, and it's become kind of like the focal point of who I am as a woman, as a fisher, as an environmental justice advocate, it's really become a core part of my identity.
I love that. And I will say another part of it that I love is that I know you're not a social media person, like TikTok is your only platform. And if that goes, you're offline and we got to find you in the wild. You share on your TikToks what it's like to be on a floating house and be in relationship with the river on a daily basis. And just really like lean into and like romanticize that experience of being on the water and being on the land, which is just so beautiful.
Yeah, I feel like, being an Indigenous woman, I think some of my core values really is this intention of being in right relationship and what that looks like within my life. And so like, what does it mean to be in right relationship with myself? What does it mean to be in right relationship with the land and with animals? And like, how do I want to choose to move and navigate through this world? Because, there are so many things in everyday life that really challenge the humanity of who we are, because we live in this capitalistic structures where we can't just not work, we have to work. So yeah, I think, again, I am not a big social media person, but I am building a little presence on TikTok. And one of my main, one of the main things that I choose to share on TikTok is just looking at life through a different lens and giving people kind of a little glimpse of my life, which I feel is very unique. And being able to do that not only as a woman with like a professional career and as a mother, but as an Indigenous woman who is trying her best to live very intentionally.
I love that. Can you tell us a little bit more about your career? I know you're currently working in environmental justice and would love to hear kind of what your journey into that has been.
Yeah, so I currently work as a deputy director in the state of Oregon, and we focus on bringing the just transition framework to frontline communities. So communities who are most impacted by climate change. We strive to really uplift and support climate resilience policies and practices and really be the united voice across the state, advocating like within policies and efforts about what it means to really center and ground ourselves in kind of the frontline communities' voices and lived experiences in Oregon, because we've seen a lot of impact, most recently in Oregon, around wildfires and flooding and all of the things. And so we are really advocating to ensure that Black, Indigenous communities of colors, that their voices and lived experiences are centered around any state work that is being done when it comes to environmental justice.
That's so important. And I know you and I have had some conversations on that in the past, just the challenges of promoting equity in environmental work. Because I think there has been some good strides, but as you know, there's still a long way to go in that. And I'm wondering, in your role as deputy director, if you have any advice or thoughts on how other orgs can foster or cultivate that, either internally through their own kind of recruitment and organizational well-being and diversity, or even, what it looks like to create respectful and supportive allied partnerships.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm very proud of is really kind of as an organization, and now like within my role as a deputy, um, is how do we lean into our values and what does that actually look like in practice? And so when we're talking about doing environmental justice, it's really taking kind of a reflective, intentional approach towards, if like we know injustices are if we know injustices are happening, what are we doing that are values aligned to be in right relationship, not only with our people, but with our work? And so what we've really done this past year is cultivate balance for our team. So it meant like reduced work weeks. It means creating strategies around well-being to support our team, so that they can show up as their best selves in this work, such as like monthly well-being stipends. We have a lot of in-person team building that is really geared towards grounding and centering ourselves within the land. We do a lot of kind of like holistic approaches of making sure that when we're meeting, we really are providing food as a staple of well-being and community building. And so really approaching, like being very intentional about where we eat, who provides our foods. We do a lot of kind of like vetting, and we really support locally sourced, locally grown restaurants that are local. So I think that we've been very creative in, kind of cultivating a space where we truly are leaning into this idea that it is not impossible to be in right relationship with ourselves, our people, our communities, the land, and the water.
That's so real. And I think I really hope more nonprofits and environmental justice orgs can look to that and learn from what you guys are doing, because I think in general, like speaking for myself as someone who used to lead a nonprofit before I came into this position, um, I know what it's like when you feel that pressure to constantly penny pinch. Um, and I think we kind of get like guilted into like, well, we need to, get the most bang for our buck, which means that we need to be really conservative about how we spend on our staff and how we spend internally. But ultimately, that leads to like staff needing extra sick leave because they're working themselves till they're sick, or staff not staying on in the long term because they're burnt out, and not, being able to come to work as their full best selves because they're not getting the full support they need to be that. So I love that you guys are role modeling that.
Yeah, I think one of the values that I bring, because I previously in our early in our relationship, in our friendship, I previously was an executive director of a gender-based violence organization, really focused on supporting tribal communities. And one of the hardest lessons that I learned through that experience is, as an Indigenous leader, you feel this immense pressure to really take on a lot and do a lot, and, at the expense of yourself. And so I really burnt out in that role. And so the aftermath of that, as I'm healing and really trying to figure out within myself, what where does the magic exist within me? And I think I take a lot of my past experiences so that I can advocate for those boundaries. Because one of the things I used to say is, I really wish somebody could have saw me burning out and come in and be like, hey, I see what's happening. How can I support you? And so in turn, I think that I've really aligned myself with this idea that I don't want to burn people out. I don't want people to get to the point where, they lose passion for this work. And I think that's the number one thing when I'm thinking about like social capital as our people. It's their passion, it's their excitement, it's the fact that, they most of them aren't doing this for a paycheck. The paycheck is good, like we need it. And also that's not the driving motivation. I think so much within workspaces, there are so many things on the daily that attempt to reduce our humanity. We have scarcity mindset. We have, our own limiting beliefs. We might have capitalization or capitalism. We're facing different injustices. We're coming from communities that are directly impacted by climate change. And so my job as a leader is to create spaces where we're dismantling and undoing those things so that people can be human and that we can humanize this work, and really lean into how do we sustain our best selves and our most meaningful work in a way that is in alignment to conservation, to land, to water, to animals, to the bigger picture.
I think Indigenous women are like extra prone to that burnout because we're carrying so much for our families and our communities, our tribes, for Indigenous peoples in general, and then also whatever career field we're in. And also, like, I think I'll speak for myself. I feel like there's this attitude in Indian country, especially, that like Native women are just supposed to work ourselves into the ground, and like it's never enough. And the more leadership you show, the more work you get, and it leads to burnout, and it can lead to a lot of unhealthy working environments and things like that. And so, do you think there's things specifically that the conservation world or environmental justice world should be doing to really foster and nurture Indigenous women's leadership, inclusive of like that kind of perspective on well-being and rest?
Yes, I think it's really important for us in this work, no matter what role we have, that we need to constantly have that personal check-in with ourselves so that we are modeling examples of what well-being looks like in action, specifically in the workplace. As a deputy director, I supervise our directors and our managers, and it is my responsibility to show them that when I'm sick, I take leave, that when I need a break, I'm taking leave, that it's okay to call in. They have to see me doing it so that they can know that it is okay. Like, we are all human. Life happens. Things are coming up. I think it's unhealthy for us to kind of set this unrealistic expectation that we just bulldoze through and do the work and get it done, and we don't take care of ourselves. And so I really practice and try my best to lean into my own teachings of when I feel myself getting overwhelmed, taking moments to decompress, taking moments to reconnect with the land. We had a team retreat, and I was having our staff go out every morning with me to give offerings to the water as a collective, as a team. and really take moments at the beginning of our day to ground ourselves and center ourselves. And before we can ground and center the work, we really have to start with ourselves. And so I feel like, again, there has to be like a stronger sisterhood of Indigenous women, if and within environmental justice work, of making space for it okay for us to be human. I used to talk about how, like, my grandma, there were times that, we were food insecure and we didn't have a lot of food, but my grandma somehow managed to go to like empty cupboards and create magic. Like, she would be able to feed our huge family with very little food. And I would feel really bad about that because I always felt like the standard was, no matter what, I need to make it work. No matter what, I need to figure it out. No matter if I'm tired, I need to wake up and get it done and just keep bulldozing through. But the reality is, then we create kind of this space where other people feel like they have to do the same. And that is what leads to unhealthy work culture, is if we can't show the human parts of us in workspaces, then our teams start to feel like they can't be human either, that they have to be robots. And that's just not how we are created.
I love that you mentioned like creating that sisterhood and having space to be full humans, because that's actually a dialogue that we've been having kind of internally at Artemis, thinking about how we want to see Artemis grow and change. And the phrase that I keep coming back to is like being our full authentic selves. That there's a million different ways to be a woman hunter or angler, and that there's room for all of that. And that there's no, like, I think, you and I have talked about this before, that hunting and angling both have this like culture of perfectionism where it feels like you have to get it right because, nobody's posting the videos except you. You post videos sometimes, and we should talk about that. Nobody's posting videos of them like falling in the river or something, right? But like, it happens to all of us at some point. All of us have like bought the wrong gear or messed something up somehow. Like, that's just the reality of learning something that's highly technical and really specific to what you're doing and where you're doing it. But being able to like hold space for like that humility while also fostering like each other's success and encouraging each other and being able to be that full human that's like, I'm a badass fisherwoman, but also I fell in the river last week, and having both those things be true.
Yeah, so it's actually really funny because I was reflecting on this as we come up with potentially this TikTok ban of like, actually, how did I get into being on TikTok? And it really started with, coming and moving into a space where I wanted to start learning how to fish for specific types of fish. So I wanted to learn how to steelhead fish, and I wanted to learn how to do bank fishing for salmon. And if you aren't really raised in that world, it can be very daunting. It can be intimidating. And so I got on TikTok and I was like, be with me while I'm teaching myself how to learn, and I'm learning how to do my own lines. And it was really hard in the beginning because a lot of things that work for other people didn't work for me. You can read and look at other people's videos, but if you don't understand how to read the water, how to read the conditions, like how to rig your lines, or even what lines you should be using, what bait you should be using, it can be a really long process. And I feel like I've done trial and error. But in the end, I've been very successful. And I think I had to give myself a lot of grace because, as you're saying, when I first bought my waders, I was so excited, but I bought the wrong boots and I slipped. And that could have been very devastating. Like, I could have went into the river, and, you only have a few moments, especially here in the Pacific Northwest. Like, if you slip into the river, your waders could fill up really fast. Like, there are like very real dangers, especially if you are fishing alone. And so there are just things that I've learned along the way, and I try my best to share with other people. Like recently, I posted a TikTok about pre-tying my lines because last year I learned, my lines kept, I kept getting snagged, my lines kept breaking. I hooked a huge buck, and like it just tore my line out. It was so cold that the tip of my rod actually snapped. So there's so many things that you learn. And so this year I was like, I don't want to spend all my time on the river tying my lines over and over again. So I pre-tied all my lines. I think in these spaces, especially when it comes to hunting and fishing, is modeling the grace and space to ask questions, to support people and understand that we are all learning. We've all been there. We all started somewhere. Because I know when I first started, I thought at first, I was like, I must be really annoying. I'm asking all these questions. But I had really strong core people in my life who were like, no, this is fine. They would explain, why I need certain weight on my main line. They would, give me kind of like real world experiences of why they rig something a certain way. Or, like for the longest time, I was fishing for steelhead and didn't even know that steelhead aren't really scent driven. And this entire time I was trying to make my bait like appealing for scent, not knowing that steelhead really aren't about scent. And so I think being a girl's girl in these different spaces is really giving grace and space for other women to ask questions and feel comfortable and feel supported, but also being empowered and championed. Like it's so exciting to see someone get into like basically fishing is my therapy. So it's so exciting for me to see other people gravitating towards that because I know what it's done for me and especially what it's done for my own confidence. And so when I see other people kind of like other women wanting to get more into fishing, like I'm all about that.
I think that kind of like sisterhood and like being able to meet every woman where she's at in the learning process, and explain that like it's not about catching the fish, it's about the experience and being out on the water and all of the mental health benefits and the spiritual benefits from it, and being able to mentor women in that way and have there be room for everyone in the circle regardless of skill level, I think is so cool.
One of the things that I would recommend to people is to research where you're going before you actually go so that you can make sure you have the right gear. I think there is talent in learning how to read water levels, like tide, all of those things. But it's like, I think there's kind of a misperception of like, I just show up and go fishing, but I actually do a lot of like thought and research behind it. And so that's really important to me as well. As a woman who has struggled most of my adult life being undiagnosed with ADHD, when I was finally diagnosed with ADHD, it started to make sense why fishing was like could hold my attention because it's not just me throwing my rod in and standing there, but it's like I'm thinking about the way that I'm rigging my line. I'm thinking about how fast the current is moving. I'm thinking about the water levels. I'm thinking about the time of the season. Like you have so many different things that are moving. And it actually was one of the first things that created space for me to just focus. And it like drowned out all of the world, like all of the voices, all of the sound, background noise. And I could never explain it until I was actually diagnosed with ADHD, like officially. And I started researching. And I was like, wow, that's why fishing always made sense to me because it can hold my attention and drown everything out.
I had my mom call me recently while I was fishing, and I was like, I can't talk about this. I'm fishing. And she was like, you're literally just sitting on the river. You can talk. And I was like, no, I'm fishing. And I feel the same way about like my first experience hunting recently and like sitting in a deer blind it was for me, like similarly, I have ADHD and have PTSD. And so sometimes those like meditative exercises really don't work for me. Like the stuff that's like, picture yourself on an island and the water is blue and calm and all that. Like, I can't do that because my mind goes to the island and doesn't come back. Like, it'll take me a whole day to get back inside my body. But fishing and hunting are different because you're still meditative in that way, but you're hyper present instead of dissociating to some kind of imaginary island, which was really beneficial for me and my mental health. Because yeah, you're reading the water, you're listening for sounds, you're looking at how the light is falling, you're thinking about the different weights on your line, and like there's just so much that goes into it that you have to be hyper present for, or even sitting in the deer blind, and like you have to be hyper aware of even your own breath and the sound that you're making. And that was like truly, I don't know that I've had an experience like that that's been that beneficial for my mental health.
When I go fishing, not only am I able to be very present in my body and with the land, the water, and all of the things that are like kind of co-occurring around me, but it's really helped me to be intentional with just the way that I choose to walk through the world. I think that fishing slows you down. It makes you strategize. It makes you more intentional. It makes you kind of it creates space for you to just be truly connected with all of the things happening around you. I always talk about on TikTok of how, crabbing, gathering clams, harvesting mussels, fishing, and then feeding my family, cooking for them has really become my Indigenous love language for not only them, but for what exists within me, because I take so much pride. And the crabs that I keep, the clams that I'm picking, I take so much pride in making sure that I'm making offerings for these animals to care and nurture my loved ones. And I think that is a practice, again, like we all are carrying kind of the ripple effects of intergenerational trauma. And until we have space to really think and move outside of survival mode, because when we're in survival mode, we're just thinking about that day. We're thinking about what we need to get done, how we're going to put food on the table, how we're going to pay our bills. But I think one of the greatest gifts that we can give ourselves is the intentional practices of like moving and shifting out of that into a place where we can be more intentional with the way that we move through our daily lives. I sometimes get really overwhelmed, and I have to like take a moment and pause and reground. But I think that that's where true healing is going to come for our communities. When somebody sees other people healing, other people being intentional, and then they're like, okay, I don't have all the time in the world. I'm working 2 jobs, but I can go outside and make an offering. I remember when I was down in, I was at a conference in Montgomery, Alabama, and I didn't really have a lot of access to walk to the water. And so I just got a cup of water and I would just put my little tobacco in that cup of water. And after a few days, I had like this cup of tobacco and water. And then I made a walk down to the river. And so there's ways that we can modify our practices to meet our situations. Like we aren't always going to have access to water, but we can do little things like that ground us in our daily practices.
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me, I had an auntie tell me that like, if you're in a place where you can't smudge, like, I don't know, I've been at conferences where like, there's just not enough time to get outside to do that privately. And there's smoke alarms everywhere. And so she said, like, if you can't, or if you don't have access to medicine or anything like that, you can just take some water, like take a cup of water, sit with it, pray with it. You can rub it on yourself, and that's just as good. Because water is a medicine too. So yeah, that made me think of that and just how healing, even just something as simple as a cup of water can be.
Yeah, me and my cousin, we were down in Manzanillo, and we had gone on a tour, and they took us to this waterfall. And I was like, oh my gosh, we don't have tobacco. We don't have anything to offer. And I was like, actually, it's okay. Like, let's just go to the water. Let's put our feet in. Let's introduce ourselves. Let's honor like the ancestral lineages that like exist in that water and just like greet them and like introduce ourselves. And that's like, I feel like we get so kind of caught up sometimes in like ceremonies and practices have to be very rigid. But I think as Indigenous people, we move through the world so fluidly that it's okay to not have an offering. Like introduce yourself, ground yourself, connect with the water, the land. I think what's most important is that we each have the space to decide what our morning practices, what our morning ceremonies look like. And if it works for us, it works. But one of the teachable moments that I've had recently in this experience is really just I used to be excited to go fishing like all the time because it's therapy, right? Like you want to do it all the time. But when we're really thinking about sustenance and sustainable practices, I'm good with catching 2 fish and calling it a day because then I can put 2 fish in the freezer of my family. I don't need to catch all the fish. And I think that's my growth journey. That's like the maturing of who I am because I used to want to catch the biggest fish.
You're a highly competitive person. Yes.
I am. And I know that y'all had Vanessa on the podcast and it was really cute. I spent the weekend with Vanessa and her son one weekend and he was telling me about his first salmon. And he was like telling me what he was doing and he was so excited. And Vanessa was like, but what did you do first? Like when you caught your salmon, what was the first thing that you did? And he was thinking and he was like, I said, welcome home. And so she's teaching because the salmon leave the rivers into the ocean and then they return and they're returning home. And so he was like, you have to greet the salmon. And I thought that was so beautiful. And it really shifted the way that I want to be a fisher person. I don't want to just be about catching all the fish, doing all the things. Like I really do want to live in alignment to like taking care of them because they're taking care of us. Yeah.
That's so beautiful. And I think a really nice spot to end, but I also want to give you a chance to share anything, if there's anything else that you'd like to share with us.
To any women out there, especially women of color or Indigenous women who are looking to get into fishing, find your people. Find people who are going to champion you, who are going to empower you, who are going to create spaces for you to ask questions and ask questions. Like, don't be afraid. There's never wrong questions. There, like the world of fishing can be intimidating, but until you find your people, I think that's really where the magic is going to happen because you're going to find the sisterhood, the friends, the people who are like ride or dies. So I just wanted to encourage everyone, like if you're really considering fishing, find a group of women who are on similar journeys as you and like really like lean into this world. So, yes, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Today's podcast was edited by Tanner Saul. For more details about the episode, don't forget to check the show notes.